Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the Overseas Leafs Report. So you'll notice the surroundings have changed a little bit. Truth is, I'm still on Borneo. More specifically, 2 ferries and a handful of driving away from my original location. While still familiar, it is quite different, obviously. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for where the Leafs find themselves at this point in the season. Having played 30 games, the Leafs have amassed exactly 30 points. The biggest news, of course, is the Leafs firing Mike Babcock with 3 years remaining on his deal, following a 6-game losing streak, ultimately a 4-2 loss in Las Vegas, signaled the change and brought in Sheldon Keefe from the Marlies. Now, I won't get into the allegations of abuse currently being directed at Babcock because I think that's still an ongoing story. But what I think was obvious, and I think this was clearly the case after the 6-1 loss in Pittsburgh, was that the Leafs players had grown disinterested in playing for Babcock. I think had tuned out his message, and I think it was a situation that was ripe for change. And I think this new voice in the room did provide dividends early on. The Leafs strung together 3 straight wins on the road, first in Arizona, then in Colorado, and completed that portion of the road trip with a big win versus the Detroit Red Wings. That momentum was halted ultimately in Buffalo during the first game of the back-to-back games. The Leafs battled back and forth. It was a close game, but ultimately lost 6-4. Follow that up the second night with a gutsy overtime win against the same Buffalo Sabres, John Tavares scoring the winner in that one. And one of the many changes that we noticed right away in variation of Babcock's tactics was Michael Hutchison, who had been recalled from the Marlies earlier in the week, playing the first game of that back-to-back. He remains winless on the season, having given up at least 4 goals in each of his starts. So there's definitely an area of concern there. And then Freddie Anderson played the second game, which was the win in overtime versus Buffalo. Some early returns as well from the Sheldon Keefe era is the awakening of Tyson Barrie. Also notice some line shuffling, which should produce some more balanced scoring. But on the flip side, you may notice a revised role for Zach Hyman, who was a previous Babcock favorite. Most recently, the Leafs are coming off another back-to-back, first with a game in Philadelphia, and then the next night welcoming Nazem Kadri back to Toronto for his first game back in a Colorado Avalanche uniform. So the Leafs were back to some old habits of giving up the first goal in both of those games. But the box score from the game in Philadelphia will show some very concerning trends that I think have plagued this Maple Leafs roster since the beginning of the season. If you look from the 10-minute mark of the third period, the Philadelphia Flyers scored 5 unanswered goals with the Leafs star players on the ice, which is reflected in a William Nylander -4, Austin Matthews -3, Morgan Riley -3, and the list goes on. After the game, Austin Matthews came out and admitted that the Maple Leafs gave up after that goal at the 10-minute mark. You never want to hear any players give up. At least he's being honest, and I think that shows that he's aware of the issues and what the Leafs specifically need to work on moving forward. Defensively, you knew the Leafs were going to come out with a better effort the next night versus Colorado. Obviously an emotional game with Nazem Kadri back in the building. And this defensive mentality was evident through the first portion of the game. However, the issues with the special teams still remain. The Colorado Avalanche opened the scoring with a power play goal. Leafs equalized with a nice surprise goal from Zach Hyman. But then on their own power play, I think one of the all-time biggest mistakes or most laughable moments we've seen this season, Jason Spezza without a stick at the blue line, I'm still not too sure what his intentions were, but he clearly got in the way of Morgan Riley, who was unable to keep the puck in the zone. Valery Nikushin from the Colorado Avalanche went out on a clear breakaway and scored the game-winning goal. Donskoy added the empty netter, which sealed the Leafs' fate. They now find themselves back in a losing streak, having lost the last two. Which brings us to the current Eastern Conference standings. Boston is comfortably in the lead, having amassed 45 points. Currently in second is Florida and Buffalo. The rest of the playoff positions in the Eastern Conference are taken up by teams from the Metropolitan Division. You've got Washington with a comfortable lead over the New York Islanders and Philadelphia Flyers. The two wildcard spots are currently held by the Pittsburgh Penguins and the Carolina Hurricanes. So where does that leave the Leafs? Truth is, the Leafs find themselves still battling with other teams from the Atlantic Division, namely the Montreal Canadiens and Tampa Bay Lightning, which are all close with 30 or 29 points. The most concerning part still is that the Leafs have played their 30 games, whereas Montreal, currently experiencing their own struggles, has 2 games in hand, and Tampa Bay still has 5 games in hand. So there's no denying that this season is full of inconsistencies already, but I'm not ready to call it a lost season. And I do feel like I'm repeating myself in saying, well, I still don't have a clear idea of what this team is, and I need to see more before I can give a full assessment. So I'm gonna kick this judgment down the road again and look ahead at the upcoming games for the Maple Leafs. So having completed the first week of December and only accumulating 1 point, the Leafs next face the defending Stanley Cup champions in St. Louis before embarking on the Western Canadian road trip, which will begin with a game in Vancouver, followed by a game versus the Flames, and then the Edmonton Oilers. The Leafs will end the month with 6 games in a row versus potentially beatable opponents. It'll be interesting to see how many points they can accumulate during that stretch and going into 2020 where they find themselves. I look forward to catching up with you again shortly. In the meantime, go Leafs, go! The Twitter account hasn't changed, @Overseas Leafs. Go check that out for any updates during and after all Maple Leafs games.